Okay, hello. Hi, everybody. Thank you for coming, and even on a rainy day. This is the kind of day that, at least for me, the sofa becomes like a magnet, and I don't want to leave my house. Am I projecting? Probably. So I really appreciate you coming. Before I introduce the mayor, who's going to say a couple of words, just to talk about Harry and Barbara Ezrati. Harry is a maritime lawyer and a historian. Barbara is a journalist and a book publisher. Barbara and I worked together in one of the newspapers in Puerto Rico many years ago. And one of the first things that struck me about Barbara was the clarity with which she wrote about anything. And rarely do I see that kind of clarity in journalism or in the English language. We became friends. We hung out a lot together. And because I was the editor of a section.
My boss, she was my boss.
Yeah. So she was a restaurant reviewer. One of the perks was she had to take me with her to review restaurants. And one of the things that I like about what's happening today is that we're learning about Puerto Rico and from a different perspective. From the perspective, what the work that Barbara did, speaking with a lot of Puerto Ricans on the island to come up with this book, Puerto Rico Oral Histories. And also about the Caribbean, with Harry Ezrati, the Jewish Caribbean. And it turns out, what is it, like 20% of Latinos?
25% worldwide, Latinos have Jewish genes, and 20% of the men in Iberia have Jewish genes. That's not a guess. That was a study done by the Hebrew University, together with the university in Portugal and 2 universities in Spain.
Okay, so then before Harry begins, okay, so L'chaim, I would like to introduce you to our mayor, Mayor Alex Morse.
Thank you, Natalia, and I just want to thank Natalia for being such a great community member here in Holyoke, now representing Holyoke Media, doing a fantastic job, and Scott from Holyoke Media is here as well recording this event, and so if you have friends or family that aren't able to be here today, make sure they catch this online or at the Holyoke Media website. We'll make sure to share it at the Facebook page, and if you don't follow them yet, type in Holyoke Media and follow the page. I want to thank Barbara and Harry for being here as well for this really important event. I know there's been a lot of buzz in the community the last few weeks for this conversation. I see a lot of familiar faces, particularly from the Jewish community, Sons of Zion, other community groups that have a particular interest in linking both the Puerto Rican community here in Holyoke and also the Jewish community here in the city. And I personally appreciate the contributions, or more contributions to the oral history and the history in general, documenting the contributions of Puerto Ricans in particular to our community, and now an opportunity to talk about the relationship between the Puerto Rican community and Judaism altogether. So I'm looking forward to this conversation. I apologize I can't stay the entire time. We'll stay as long as I can, but I just wanted to help welcome you both to Holyoke, and thank you for your contributions and conversation this afternoon.
Thank you. My pleasure now to introduce you to, as we say in Spanish, Licenciado Harry Ezrati, historian, who's going to be talking about his book, 500 Years of the Jewish Caribbean.
Good evening. Thank you for inviting us. Really, it's an honor and a pleasure to be here. And for Natalia, we do most anything. Most anything. When I was a youngster growing up in the Bronx, I was taught that the major province in the United States and the biggest colonial influence in the United States was Plymouth, New England. That's what we learned. And my wife, who was raised in Maryland, learned that Jamestown was the most important colonial city in the growth of America. Our teachers were wrong. The Spaniards were here 100 years before, and they came up from Florida and moved west. For those of you who have ever traveled on Interstate 10, they followed the route of Interstate 10. They went from Florida to Mississippi and Alabama. They went to Louisiana Texas, Arizona, and finally wound up in California. They went up to Colorado, Utah, and all those, even as far as Tennessee. So the Spaniards were here before, and who came with them? People that were settlers. And who were the settlers? Many of them were Jewish. So for those people who say, well, you know, the Jewish migration to the United States started in 1890, they're wrong. And when I teach this, I always get at the end of the class, somebody comes up to me and says, how come we didn't learn this in religious school? And I said, don't blame me, go to your teachers. Who were these people that came with the conquistadores? They were soldiers to protect the settlers. They were blacksmiths, they were bakers, they were butchers, they were farmers, they were lawyers, they were doctors. But they came as secret Jews, crypto Jews. Why did they come as secret Jews? Because they had been forced to change their religion under threat of death, under threat of loss of all their property and their children and their family. And so they all converted. The whole population of Portugal in 1497 was completely and totally eliminated as Jewish, and it became Catholic, forcibly. So in order for these people to get out of this horrible situation, which was they're facing the Inquisition, they had to find a place to go to that wasn't going to be so inhospitable. And they figured they're going to come to the New World. And they came as Catholics. That's how they came. Otherwise, they couldn't come. The Spanish law was that you couldn't settle in a Spanish province or anywhere in Spain or any of its colonies if you were Jewish. And if you were fourth generation converted, and you still couldn't do it. It had to be past fourth generation, which means, ladies and gentlemen, as I always say to my class, King Ferdinand couldn't come to the United States or the Spanish colonies because his grandmother was Jewish. So that's something that maybe you didn't know. Okay. So wow. They come, and they come with false papers. Priests who are friendly make up false baptism certificates, because you had to have what was known as a certificado de limpieza de sangre, a certificate of blood purity, that your blood was pure. You didn't have any Moorish, nor did you have any Jewish blood in you for 4 generations. Otherwise, you couldn't come to the colonies. Otherwise, you couldn't even live in Spain. Now, by the way, you know there's a town in Mexico called Matamoros? You know what it means? Kill the Moors. There was a town in Spain called Mata Judíos, kill the Jews. So this is what they were facing. And they came and they settled. And they got, for 500 years, secretly practicing some of the Jewish elements. And because they didn't have rabbis, they lost much of the rights, and they kept certain rights that were there all the time, like lighting a candle on a Friday night or doing some other things, which we'll go into in a few minutes. Now, I have to say that what we're talking about is worldwide. In other words, if you go to New Mexico, you will find thousands of people who know that they had a Jewish background, who know that their families came with the conquistadors, who are secretly still practicing Jewish rites, and even today, they do not want you to know that they're Jewish, or that they had a Jewish background. Now, my purpose here today is to show that there's a very close affinity between Latinos and the Jewish community. Because the people that we're talking about are Latinos. The New Mexicans are Latinos. They speak Spanish, they speak English, they live in what they call pueblecitos, little towns with Spanish names, and they live a Spanish life. even though we're in, 2010, 2020, 2019 America. So, if you don't believe me, in 1960, the newly ordained bishop of Santa Fe was very angry. And he went before his parishioners and he said, "There's no such thing as Saint Esther. Why are you praying to Saint Esther?" Huh? In Spanish, Santa Esterica. There is no, he was absolutely livid. This was the secret Jews' way of practicing Judaism. Now, if you think that that's something off the wall, I brought with me, off the internet, on the 7th of April, Saint Esther in Palma de Mallorca for Purim. Okay? So it's something, as I said, it's worldwide. I worked with this phenomenon with my wife in Puerto Rico. But I'll get to that, and we'll talk about who these people are, how they get to you, and all of that. But I want you to understand, it is such a close relationship that most of you don't realize how close it is. I'm going to try to explain it to you today. Okay, so I am on the board of directors of an organization called the Society for the Study of Crypto Jews. Most of the crypto Jews that we study come from New Mexico, Colorado, Arizona, Texas. And when you go up, for those of you who've been to New Mexico, the mountains are rugged and they're beautiful. And the people that came with the conquistadores, when they came to Nueva España, which is what it was called, Mexico, and the area that we are talking about in Colorado and New Mexico, that area, when they got there, they found out they were running away from an inquisition. There was an inquisition in Mexico City. Not only was it so terrible, it took the family of the governor of New Spain, his name was Carvajal. They killed 40 members of his family in fires because they were secret Jews practicing as heretics, and put him in jail for the rest of his life. So they decided they're going to move away from Mexico City, 1,500 miles up to Albuquerque, Taos, and those little areas up there that we know. Santa Fe, all these little towns. 1,500 miles with mule and horse going up these mountains would take months because the Indians, the Yaquis Indians, would attack the train, and there were also robbers and thieves along the trail. So they were safe. Safe. Today, these people want to come back to Judaism. But they don't know how to do it. So what do they do? They come into places like El Paso or Albuquerque, and they sit and they listen, and they come up and talk to a rabbi or some other members of the congregation, and they get very upset when they find out that they have to be converted in order to become a member of the Jewish community. Because they feel that they and their families kept the Jewish religion in their family for centuries. Centuries. And they feel that it's an insult to make them convert. That's a problem. It's a problem the rabbis have to face. Now, what I'm telling you is not limited to New Mexico or Colorado. Anywhere in the world where there are mountains and Latinos living, you will find them in mountains. In Portugal, in Belmonte in the mountains, a whole complete village of crypto Jews living there were not discovered until 1913 by a Jewish engineer. Can you wait until I finish?
Could you just define crypto?
I'm sorry?
Can you just define crypto Jews?
Okay.
I don't know.
Crypto means secret.
Okay.
Okay? Yeah, it's a secret. I think I said secret Jews and crypto. When you talk to a crypto Jew, they'll whisper. They'll make sure nobody's around them. And they'll talk to you like that. This is 5 centuries after they got out of Spain. Think of that. Okay, so we have areas in Mexico. We have areas in South America, Peru, Colombia, Ecuador, where Jews came with the conquistador and we find natives practicing Jewish rites in the mountains. Okay, so for those of you who really don't know too much about the Sephardic, the Spanish Jews, the history of the Sephardic Jews. By the way, the word Sephardic comes from Sepharad in Hebrew, which means Spain. The Jews of Spain were evicted, expelled in 1492. And most of them left Spain, and a very large amount went across the border into Portugal, because it was nearby, an easy place to go. In 1497, the king of Portugal wanted to marry one of the daughters of Isabella and Ferdinand. Isabella said, as long as there are Jews living in Portugal, there can't be a marriage. That's how they were forcibly converted. To a man and a woman. There was no exception. The king gave them 30 years to stop practicing all Jewish rites. But after the 30 years, they would be in trouble if they were caught, because they would be heretics. So let's talk a little bit about the Caribbean, because I lived in Puerto Rico for 35 years. As a maritime attorney, I had to travel all over the islands. I had to go to Barbados, I had to go to any island for my clients where there would be a maritime, if there were maritime collision or a maritime event that I went representing a client. And as I went through the islands, I got curious. And I see in Barbados, in St. Thomas, in Curacao, in Jamaica, in St. Eustatius, cemeteries going back to the 1600s. You have to be able to speak Spanish, Hebrew, or Portuguese in order to read the gravestones. In my book, I have some of the gravestones. They're very elaborate. If you were a moil, that is a circumciser, on the gravestone there would be a knife that's used by the circumciser. If you were a scribe, you had a pen, a hand with a pen on the gravestone. They're beautiful, they're elaborate. If you owned ships, there was a sailing ship on your gravestone. So you could look at someone's gravestone and you could tell who he was. If he was a rabbi, he had the hands like that. Like Spock. Right? Okay. So I said, what is this? These were the Portuguese and the Spaniards who came out of Spain and came with the conquistadors, and at the first opportunity that they had, they went back to Judaism. But they were only 2 or 3 generations away. It wasn't difficult to be able to figure out a genealogy to say, I'm Jewish from my mother's line, which is Jewish people know you have to have a maternal line in order to be able to prove your Jewishness. So these were the people who came back to Judaism. And I was fascinated, so I started reading about them and learning about them and speaking with their descendants. And I found that on the islands of Cuba, the Dominican Republic, and Puerto Rico, we didn't have that because Jews couldn't settle in these colonial places because Spain had this law, no Jews. But in 1700s, a very famous actress in Cuba, when she was buried, in her will she said, bury me as a Jew. We know that in Mayaguez, a city on the western coast of Puerto Rico, there were 3 Jewish families who came from Curacao. If you came from Curacao, you spoke Spanish, you had a Spanish name, you had a Spanish family name, and it was very easy to meld in. So they got in, didn't have too much of a problem. We do know that in the 1700s, a person by the name of Cohen was caught dealing with soldiers and was executed because he was in Spanish territory. He shouldn't have been there. So now let me tell you, let's talk a little bit about how these people get to you and what they want from you, and why they want to come back to Judaism. In Puerto Rico, there were two synagogues. One was Reform, one was Conservative. The Reform synagogue, when I came to Puerto Rico, and my wife came to Puerto Rico in 1969, was completely and totally gringo. Totally. We had Frenchmen, we had an Englishman, we had Canadians, but everybody they were not Latinos. We had one person who was born in Guayaquil, but he was the son of Holocaust survivors. I don't consider him a Latino because he was very European oriented. Today in Puerto Rico, that synagogue is 75% Puerto Rican. So how did that happen? How it happened is what happening all over the world, and let's talk about it. So in Puerto Rico, we were a very small congregation. We didn't have rabbis. And so 4 of us, I was one of them, once a week during the month, we would do a service. And I was, at the time, probably the only person in the congregation who was a good Spanish speaker. And so at the end of the service, I noticed in the back people who were not from our congregation and who were obviously they're curious. And so they came over to me with halting English, and when I started talking to them in Spanish, they became very friendly with me. And we had 3 types of people that came. We had people who knew that their family was Jewish and wanted to get back and wanted to know how they could do it. We had people who knew they were family, who had thought that their family was Jewish and were curious, so wanted to know what it was all about and all that. And we had people that just came by and were curious, nothing more. Okay, so the people came to us, and the first thing they said is, am I Jewish? My mother or my grandmother lit candles every Friday night. I mean, no matter where you go, you're going to see that. By the way, there are 300,000 people like this in Brazil. In Brazil alone. The rabbis are complaining that the Jewish people are getting less and less populous. They got this wonderful, wonderful group of people that want to become Jewish again, and nobody's doing anything about it. Okay, I'm just a historian, okay, and I'm an observer. Okay, so what else? Oh yeah, they had a little candle that had a lot of 6 or 7 candles, and I remember in the fall they would go down to the river and throw bread in the water. For those of Latinos who don't know what that is, you're casting your sin. This is a Latino right there, right? No? You cast your sins into the water. That's part of Rosh Hashanah, the New Year's Day ritual that we cast our sin. And then on certain days we don't fast, and we never eat pork. We don't eat pork. And where did these people come from? The mountains of Puerto Rico. Now Puerto Rico is a small island. It's 110 miles wide and 65 miles in width. And so it's very small, but the mountains are there. And I imagine that they were a barrier during the time that they were trying to escape from not only the religious authorities, but the civil authorities. Because once the religious authority got a hold of them, according to church law, they were not permitted to spill blood. You could torture someone, but church law said you couldn't spill blood and you couldn't kill. So what they did was, once they found somebody guilty, they turned them over to the civil authorities who did it for you. They were the surrogates of the church, okay? So these people come here. Now we had another group that definitely wasn't They definitely didn't have any kind of Jewish background. These were Puerto Ricans, many of whom were descendants of slaves who were born Catholic and were dissatisfied with the Catholic Church. So they tried Jehovah's Witness, and they tried the Seventh-day Adventists, and they tried a lot of different religions, and finally came to the synagogue, and we had at least 3 families that were so, when they got converted, were so into being Jewish and so loving of their decision to become Jews. It was fascinating to look at. So we have now these groups of people who are now struggling and working to try to get back to Judaism. So why do I say that the Jews and Latinos are one? Because you can see these Latinos are Jewish. You don't have to go any further than that. They're Jewish. When I was telling Natalia this afternoon at lunch, I fill out questionnaires for one of the Pew, one of these people, and they ask me a lot of questions. Who am I? What am I? And then there's a question: are you Hispanic? Are you Caucasian? I filled in Hispanic. Why did I fill in Hispanic? Because on both sides of my family, they came from Spain. And I lived for 35 years in Puerto Rico, waking up in the morning speaking Spanish, going to bed at night speaking Spanish. In the office, I spoke Spanish. How could I be anything less than a Latino? But I'm also a Jew, and a very religious one. I'm not Orthodox, but I'm very, very aware of my Jewishness. So this is something that we should look at. Latinos and Jews should look at as an event and as a project to try to bring back into the fold these people who are lost, because they are lost. There's no question about it. If we don't help them, they'll be lost, because this is their only opportunity now. It's 500 years. In my house, we spoke Spanish. 500 years. We spoke Spanish. We ate Spanish food. I didn't have potatoes and French fries. I grew up with eggplant. We didn't have chicken fat. We had olive oil. We were living like Mediterraneans. You see, there's the concept, and that's something that I try to when I talk to people, I try to get them to understand. This is something. It's a fantastic phenomenon for people to clutch onto something for 500 years. My time is up, so I'll answer any questions later after this lady gets finished with what she's doing.
Okay. In 1969, my husband said, "How would you like to move to Puerto Rico?" And I said, "Sure. Where's Puerto Rico?" That's how much I knew about the island. So I moved there, and for 6 months, I tried to go with the flow. And then I couldn't take it anymore. It was too slow a pace for me. So for the next 6 months, I would fight the system, doing everything as fast as I could, as accurately as I could, and it was a challenge. In those days, I worked at the Baldwin School, private school. My kids got half-price tuition if I sent them there. And in Puerto Rico, the public schools are taught in Spanish with English as a required subject. The private schools are taught in English with Spanish as a required subject. So my kids went to the private school, got half price. Anyway, I was going to make a point there. I can't. Anyhow, okay, go on, move on. So I found out shortly after I got to the school that the person I was replacing was not an English speaker originally. She filed everything, and the school's office was run in English. This lady filed everything under T for God. So I spent a lot of time fighting the system. But as the years went by, I got more and more interested in why the system was so different. You know, I mean, okay, it's not quite a state, it's a commonwealth, but the official language is English, and we follow the same kind of traffic laws, and the same banking system, and the same telephone system, more or less.
When it worked.
When it worked. But I didn't understand some of the discrepancies, the differences, and I decided the only way to find out is to talk to people who lived on the island when two cultures began to merge. The Spanish culture, which had been there for 400 years, and the American culture that came when they landed on the shores of Guanica. Thank you. Guanica. And I found out some interesting things. I basically put this book together for myself, but also for people in the States who don't know these stories, who haven't been to Puerto Rico, even though their families may have come from there a generation or two ago. I thought it's important to know why and how life evolved, why things are the way they were. And this is not my book. Natalia said, just do like a paragraph from the ones you want. I gotta tell you, I love the book, so. But one of the men that I interviewed about 51, 52 people for the book. The way I got these people, I figured, okay, I'm gonna start with the Spanish-American War, when the Americans first came. So what happened? What did people think about that? So I wrote a letter to the editor. I was too cheap to take ads in the paper. I wrote a letter to the editor of all of the newspapers in Puerto Rico. There were 4. One was in English and the rest were Spanish. And I said, I'm working on a project. I would like to interview people who lived on the island from 1898 to 1950. At that time, I was only going to go up to when Puerto Rico became a commonwealth in 52. And I got responses. I got a lot of responses. My first response was from the public relations officer at the mayor's office in Fajardo. In those days, to get to Fajardo, because there wasn't a highway yet, took a long time. I had a 2 o'clock appointment with this man. So I left San Juan about noon. I got to Fajardo, parked the car right in front of City Hall, went in, met the guy. He said, I got to take you to see this man. So we get in the car and we're driving up the mountain, and I'm thinking, nobody knows where I am. Nobody knows where I'm going. What if this guy's Jack the Ripper? I don't know. We get to halfway up the mountain, and the sun is now like over here, which means it was setting. And we stop in front of a colmado, a little building, you know, where you could buy cigarettes and gum and whatever else you need. And this guy, his name was Ray, he said, the man I want you to see, his name is Luis Medina. He said he was around when the soldiers came in 1898. And I thought, wow, this was in 1985. But it was still a long time, right? So I figured this guy must be very old. So you look at this, I'm in the car like this, and I'm looking out, I'm in the back, no, I'm in the front seat. I look out, I look this way, there's this small building with a square door, and you can't see what's doing in there. It's, you know, if you look this way, it's dark in there. And there comes to the door a man with a face like a walnut. All these deep, deep lines in it. Very beautiful. And he's wearing a white suit, white pants, white shirt, white vest, white jacket, hat. But he has no shoes. So he comes out, and Ray and this man talk to each other, and he gets in the car, but he won't sit next to me. So I have to go in the back, and he sits up front with Ray, because, you know, we don't know each other. And he told me his story. He was my first interview. I drove back to San Juan, I was like, wow. And even if he's a little bit wrong about the date or the years, he was still around. He said, they gave us machetes to fight them when they came, the Americans. He said, they had guns, I could have been killed. This was his memory, so it has to be true for him. Who might argue with him? That's the other thing. People told me things, and I didn't edit them, because this was their memory. This is how they believe the present happened. I am not about to fool around with that. But one man who was an architect, his name was Thomas Marvell, he said this: I suspect the annexation of Puerto Rico to the US empire was not premeditated, and the consequence was that the Americans mostly improvised the first few years. A pseudo-military government was organized, and their first efforts were to develop public work structures, schools, highways, infrastructure. These were the types of projects that the US was very adept at in those days. Schools and the public education system were especially emphasized. I can speak for the architecture, which was well designed and constructed of permanent materials. Because in those days, houses were made with palm tree leaves, palm trees on the floor. So to build these permanent structures, and you said something else. Moving along. After the Second World War, the economy began to blossom. The idea of Operation Bootstrap, that was a project where the governor of Puerto Rico put forward the idea that they had to change from being an agricultural society to being an industrial society. That's how they could lift themselves up by their bootstraps. It was the government's way of promoting development. The modern style came to the government as well as tourism, industries, and service sectors, and offices and commerce. In general, from the mid-century to the year 2000 was this industrialization period. The change was quick and abrupt. But to go back to the beginning, how did people cope with this change? Because that's what I really wanted to know. I was talking to, that's Louise. I interviewed a woman named Doña Fela. That was her nickname. Her name was Felicita Rincon de Gautier. Her husband was Gautier. She was from Fajardo. She was born in 1896. She had a big family. Her mother died when she was young, and she took care of the family after that. She made the clothing for her sisters. She cooked for her father. She entertained her father's friends. He was a prominent man. He would have, I forgot what they're called now in Spanish, you know, on a Sunday they'd have 6 guys come in and they'd sit around and talk. There's a word for it. What? That's it. Say it louder. Tortulia? That one. Okay, that's what they did. And then she would listen. While she's serving them coffee, she would be listening to them talking about all the events of the day. And then women got the right to vote. And she said, my father was very old-fashioned, and we children spent all of our time at the house. But when they gave women the right to vote, I had to face up to my father for the first time in my life. I wanted to register to vote. I came up to him and I said, with the paper, and said, Father, I want to register. And he said, no. But Father, I want to vote. And he said, no. And I said, but Father, as long as I have the right, I am going to use it. And her father then, didn't know what was going to happen, but he was so surprised that he smiled and he said, okay, if you want to vote, if you want to register, I'll take you. He took her to the polls to register. What happened is that since he was so well connected, he knew all the people who were running for office, and she became involved with the political system. They were having a big fight between two parties at that point, but later, in 1939, she was one of the organizers of the Popular Democratic Party. She became involved in many things, and she was finally elected mayor. The first woman mayor in Puerto Rico. You know, I didn't think to check to see if there were women mayors other places. I should have done that, but I didn't. But she was the first in Puerto Rico, and she was beloved. She did things like buying new garbage trucks. She said that the people who collected garbage were like beggars. There was no respect for them. She bought them new trucks. She bought them new uniforms, you know, shirts, pants, and everything changed for them.
She bought snow.
That was my next point. Hush. Children loved her. There are a couple of reasons. One is that at Christmas time, Three Kings Day, all of the children were invited to the Alcaldea, and they got presents from her. The other thing was that she brought snow to Puerto Rico, which people never forgot. I talked to people who were along in years. My God, I keep thinking, you know, I'm probably older than they were when I spoke to them. But anyway, they remembered what she did was charter a plane from the States filled with snow. They put it in the, I don't know how they got it from the airport. Well, the airport was in Rio Grande, which is not far from this big park in San Juan. They dumped it all in the park, and all the kids were invited to go play in the snow. This is something that they never forgot. It never happened before. So they all liked Doña Fela. There were many other things to like about her, too. What else can I tell you? How much time do I have? There's so many things. There's so many things.
Barbara, 5 minutes.
I got to tell you about this man, Horacio Subirá. I interviewed him and his wife at their apartment in Condado. He was from Ponce. He was born in 1905, so he knew Ponce in the early days. And I asked him a lot of questions about his childhood. He remembers when baseball came to Ponce. 2 men from the States came to teach, Mr. Garish and Charles Terry. Remember those names. They taught people, the kids in Ponce, how to play baseball. And from that day till now, I guess, until 2000 and something, every time the Ponce team won a baseball game, they would ring the bell in the town center. A tradition they continue, okay? He also saw the first airplane in Puerto Rico. Not such a happy event. The guy that flew it, where is it? Here he is, Todd Shriver from the States. He said he assumes the plane came down on a boat. The American boy, Todd Shriver, came to Puerto Rico to get flying exhibitions. He brought his plane in one of the boats. This was in 1910 or 1911. They gave exhibitions at the racetrack in Ponce, which was on the way to the beach. The streetcar went that way. And the plane went up and into a mangrove field. Smashed to nothing, the pilot was killed. He also remembered the man with the cow who used to come around every morning and milk the, you'd come out with your container and he'd milk the cow. That was like many, many, many things, and I don't have time to tell you all. You know, problem is I didn't say which was the most
They transported the milk in the belly of a cow?
They what?
They went from house to house with the cow and milked it in
Yeah.
each house?
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's cool.
There was a guy in Ponce who used to, he said, if you went to buy something in Ponce of some size, you couldn't carry it, you needed somebody with a cart to get it home for you. And there were men who had a station in Ponce, it was like a cab station, and they had carts. And so the runner from the department store, the grocery, whatever store, would go over to the station, get one of the guys to come with his cart, and you would put the stuff in the cart, and one of the men, he was an older guy, I can't remember his name right now, but it's in the book. He had a wonderful tenor voice. And you always knew when somebody had something coming from the store because this guy would be singing opera as he walked along, trundling his cart. There's a million more stories to tell and I want time, I'm sorry.
Well, the book is when you're giving the book to the library.
Yes, the one that I just marked up.
If you have any questions, Harry and Barbara will be happy to answer your questions.
Questions, questions? Nobody has a question? Okay.
I just have
No
a very
question.
simple question.
You mean I was so lucid and so clear about everything that I had to say that nobody has a question?
There's a
Yes.
question.
I didn't quite follow. You said a lot of the crypto Jews were in the mountains in Portugal and other places. Was that because it was a safer place?
I don't
Just
know.
a
Yeah.
far
Go
away?
up into the mountains.
In order to avoid having the civil and religious authorities have control over them, they would go to the mountains where it was difficult to come up on a regular basis. As I said, in Nueva España, which was New Spain, the headquarters were Mexico City. From Mexico City to, let's say, Albuquerque or Taos or Santa Fe is a 1,500-mile trip. It's almost guaranteed that when the priest or the representative of the government gets up there, they're so tired and so out of it, they don't even want to bother. Let me say this to you, something that's very interesting. When the people moved up into these areas, they intermarried. In other words, families, not within the family, that was not incestuous, but let's say the family Sanchez would always have somebody marrying into the family Garcia, or if they were friends, they would. So they maintained this love, this fire for Judaism by completely keeping it up amongst themselves. When people who were really Catholic came up, they didn't marry with them very well. Of course, rarely they did, but mostly they kept amongst themselves. And as I said, whispering, when they spoke to you about the religion, whispering so that nobody could hear. We went, the first time I went to a convention of the Society of Crypto Jews. I was not a member of the board of directors. I'm now a member, and I'm also their attorney. A woman came over to Barbara. Now you have to understand, here is a convention where people are coming down from different cities in New Mexico into El Paso, and they're outwardly letting the world know who they are. A woman goes over to Barbara in a whisper and says, "Can you give me a book on how to be a good Jew?" Whispering. It's part of their religion. It's part of their culture. Yes, ma'am.
I'm really interested in how music.
You have to speak louder.
Yes,
because-
I'm interested in how music is transmitted through culture, through generations. And I'm wondering if there was Ladino music that stayed consistent, even though the crypto Jews were not outwardly practicing, and what Ladino songs sort of made it through that diaspora.
Harry and I went to a concert last week of Ladino music. A young woman, probably your age. But the interesting thing, we've been to many concerts, but this one was fascinating because not only did she sing and had a guitar, before that, she gave a lecture with slides, about her research into the origins of the music, the difference between that same piece of music in different towns, different countries, why the words might be different. It was fascinating, fascinating. Get this lady, if you ever get a hold of this lady, Harry probably remembers her name, I don't. But anyway, the Ladino music he sings, the songs he learned as a kid at his grandmother's knee, is the same music that this lady sang to us the other night. It's fascinating, and it's in many languages.
In a minute. Does everybody know what Ladino is? It's the Spanish version of Yiddish, okay? The philologists, those are the people who are experts in language, have found elements of the Ladino language spoken by the residents of New Mexico, who still speak Spanish, by the way. Many New Mexicans are still speaking Spanish, and they have Ladino in their Spanish, which is proof that they were Jewish when they got up there, because where else would they get it? Yes, ma'am, you had a question.
Are there certain names which you could identify as being,
I'm sorry?
are there certain surnames that you can?
Yes,
identify?
okay, yeah, that's a very good question. Okay, if you have a name Toledo, Toledo was like New York City. If you came from Toledo, you know, when I went in the army, you're a New Yorker, you're a Jew. You came from Toledo, Judío, Jew, right? Toledo, de Toledo, Toledano, those are Jewish. I mean, it's not completely and totally Jewish, but very, 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 very close Jewish. My grandmother's a Castro. That's the third most popular name used by Jews who are Spanish, with a Spanish background. The most popular name amongst Spanish Jews is Leon, or de Leon, which means they come from Leon, which was a province in Spain. The next one is Garcia. Garcia is like Smith, or Jones. Everybody's named Garcia. The Spaniards, Jews took Spanish names, and it's very hard to do genealogy because sometimes you see a Jew with the name Mendez, which is, by the way, another big Jewish name. It's hard to tell if they're Jewish or they're not. So what do? If you go to Curacao, you'll see somebody by the name of Maduro. Maduro means mature, ripe. It's a popular Spanish name. So they'll say, Cohen de Maduro. Ah, you got the name Cohen in there. I know this is a Jewish Maduro. So they'll use Aboab de Fonseca. Fonseca is a Portuguese name. So they'll say Aboab, because Aboab is a Hebrew name. So they'll let you know that that they're Jewish. Okay? Not always, but a lot of times they'll do that. And for example, Mendez family. Let's talk about the Mendez family. Who here remembers who was the Prime Minister of France by the name of Mendez family, a Jew from the Mendez family, which was one of the most wealthiest Jewish families in the history of the Renaissance period. Doña Gracia de Mendez was the wealthiest Jewish woman in the world. And she escaped the Inquisition when her sister turned her in. And said, my sister is a heretic. She's a crypto-Jew. And she had to escape. She was imprisoned. She got out by telling the Sultan of Turkey, if you get me out, I'm going to bring all my money to Turkey and use it in Turkey. And she did. And she did. And she was a benefactor. But Mendez is a big Jewish name. It's not always Jewish, but it's a Jewish name. Yes?
Just a question for you. Will you forgive me for interrupting you?
It's all right. Don't worry. I mean, that was my fault. I thought I had covered that, but don't worry about it. Don't worry about it. I like your smile. Yes?
I wondered, it sounded like several of the people you met maybe had lost the knowledge that their families had Jewish heritage. And so you mentioned a couple of traditions that
Yes.
were indicators of Jewish heritage.
Yes.
Are there any others that you can share with
Yes.
us?
It's a great comment. A wonderful comment. One of the things that happened, you were talking 500 years with no rabbis. So there's certain things, Adonai, God, Shema Israel, not the whole Shema, but Shema Israel. Maybe they don't even say Adonai Eloheinu. They don't even go that far. Some do. So it's a I'm trying to look at the right word. It's a religion that's not a religion, because if I went to a service that these people had, I wouldn't recognize them. I mean, I recognize some of the Hebrew names. I recognize them lighting a candle on a Friday night. Sometimes they would get wine and bless it over it with not a Hebrew blessing, but a blessing of some sort. So it degenerated, okay? And it became more in the nature of trying to keep certain rituals like lighting candles, fasting, eating no pork. By the way, the Inquisition had 37 different ways to find out if you're Jewish. If you no smoke came out of your house on Saturday, you were a Jew. If you changed the sheets or washed on Friday night, you were a Jew. If you ate cold food on Saturday, you were a Jew. If you turned your face to the wall when you died, you were a Jew. So there's 37 of those things. Most of those things, and remember, we're talking about people who are no longer in the hands of a rabbi. They don't go to synagogue on a Saturday night, or a Saturday morning, or a Friday night. They're holding on to certain rituals. So your observation was an excellent one, and it's very true. They hold on to rituals. That's their religion. And you know, they had hidden synagogues. My wife and I were in Toledo, and we went into a shop, an antique shop. It had Jewish ritual items. It had the rimonim, the breastplates, the yards, the cups, and the candle. And I mentioned something to the owner, and he said, a doctor collected, this is in Toledo now, a doctor collected these things. When he died, the kids didn't want anything to do with it. So they gave it to me to sell. He said, are you Jewish? I said, I'm Sephardic. My family came from here, from this town. He takes me to the back of the store, opens up the door. It looks like something out of an Allen Ladd medieval, the door, you know, with the big nails on it and all. He opens it up. There's a synagogue down the steps. Can you, what is it? What is it? Think about it. It's like lemmings. It's like salmon swimming upstream. 500, okay, that's maybe 100 years afterwards. What is it 500 years later? What is it? Okay, I don't know. Yes. We're out of time, I'm sorry.
Yeah. There's a wonderful novel by an author named Noah Gordon called The Last Jew.
Yes, Last Jew in Lisbon. Yes,
Yeah,
excellent.
14,
Yeah.
15, what was the fire?
Yeah.
The earthquake, right?
We have another question?
I'm glad because my father is De Leon.
Oh,
and,
yeah?
Is it true that over 60% of the
Do you light candles on a Friday night?
no. Is it true that over 60% of the people in those three ships were Jewish?
Where?
Where was your family from?
Oh, from Puerto Rico.
But I mean,
But
before
not-
that, where did they come from?
Oh,
Do
Spain.
you know?
Spain.
See, a lot of the Jews that came to Puerto Rico, the secret Jews that came to Puerto Rico, came from the Canary Islands.
Yes.
Is that where they came from?
Yes.
Judío. Yeah.
You have this information in books?
Yes, yes. You know why? Because they were growing sugar in the Canary Islands. When they came to the Caribbean, sugar became like petroleum. Fortunes were made, and who controlled the sugar? Los Judíos, the Jews. They milled it, they packed it, and they sold it. If you had a tablespoon of sugar before they started growing it in the Caribbean, when they brought it from China over the Silk Road, a tablespoon of sugar or a teaspoon of sugar, whatever it was, cost you $500. Only a king could put it into his cocoa. He drank cocoa without sugar because it was so expensive. So that's why they came from the Canary Islands. And I have a very good friend of mine who was a doctor, whose family came from the Canary Islands, and he has name is Maldonado. And,
I'm
yeah,
Colon
have a
Maldonado. My
in your
father
family?
is Colon
What is
Maldonado.
translate it, what does it mean, Maldonado in Spanish?
I don't know.
Bad donor, a
Perdón.
bad giver. I don't know how they got that name.
Okay.
Okay, so, thank you. Thank you.